This is Dr. Mark Trexler with the Climate Countdown, exploring the growing conversation around net zero emissions by 2050 in order to avoid potentially catastrophic climate change. About 5 years ago, the scientists of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change stated that if the world could get to net zero emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050, average global temperature might stabilize at 1.5 degrees Celsius above the historical baseline, accomplishing the ambitious target of the Paris Agreement of 2015. Getting to net zero by 2050 would be an enormous accomplishment, and it would go a long way towards reducing future risks of climate change. But given that greenhouse gas emissions have been steadily increasing for decades, with the world's governments seemingly powerless to intervene, how can we possibly envision net zero by 2050? Well, companies to the rescue. Over the last few years, more and more companies have voluntarily established net zero by 2050 goals. The idea being that if all companies become net zero, then presumably the world would be net zero too. But does that idea actually hold water? Only a fraction of the world's companies are likely to adopt voluntary net zero targets. But we should still celebrate those companies that do go that extra mile, right? Not so fast. Limiting average global temperature change to 1.5 degrees Celsius would require getting to net zero globally. That requires a wide range of public policies and measures to revolutionize the energy and transportation sectors, to name just two. Exactly the kinds of policies and measures governments have been unable to implement for the last 30 years. So how do corporate net zero targets tackle this dilemma? Well, they really don't. What companies are committing to is net zero in terms of their individual carbon footprints. That sounds perfectly reasonable, since after all, the only emissions companies can directly control are their own. But it's more complicated than that. The math behind most net zero commitments, for example, assumes buying a lot of carbon offsets, as opposed to actually reducing emissions to zero. But by some estimates, more than 50% of carbon offsets might not be legitimate. And as I discussed in a previous Climate Countdown, today's favorite carbon offsets, nature-based solutions, may not even survive the impacts of climate change. So while individual corporate net zero targets may pencil out from an accounting perspective, it's much less clear that they get us significantly closer to stabilizing average global temperature. Since it's societal net zero that matters, what could companies be doing to promote that goal as opposed to focusing on their carbon footprints? Here in the US, for example, political gerrymandering and the role of money in politics are huge barriers to the climate policies needed for net zero, including robust carbon pricing. The corporate world could help overcome those barriers and play a big role in engaging with employees and customers to advance societal net zero objectives in all kinds of ways. But today's corporate net zero targets don't deal with any of that and could arguably undermine rather than advance societal net zero objectives. The idea of corporate net zero targets represents a logical fallacy in human reasoning called the fallacy of division. In the face of decades of seeming government inaction, dividing up the global net zero target among all the world's companies may sound great, but it can't work to prevent potentially catastrophic climate change. Companies should refocus on promoting net zero at the societal level. This is Mark Trexler with the Climate Countdown. Dig deeper into this and other Climate Countdown topics at our website, climatecountdown.climatesites.net. And thanks for listening.